All right, hello photographers. Welcome to another edition of Photo Blab. I'm here. Mark is back with us this week. He was gone last week, of course, and Joe Adamman. Yeah, what was that again?
The stream's working.
The what's working?
The stream.
The stream. Oh, yeah, that means we're live. Right, that's the good thing. I thought you said the spring is working. I'm like, no, the spring isn't working. We've got like 4 feet of snow outside.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a problem with that. So how is everybody doing? Let us know in the chat what you guys have been up to this week, photographically or otherwise. We always like to know. And we like to share what we've been up to, too, so we can get a feel for what everybody's doing and what's exciting in your lives. So, Mark, what have you been up to this week?
Photography related?
Yeah, or otherwise, you know, whatever.
Yeah, getting stuck in snow and then shoveling snow and getting stuck again. This weather's just absolutely ridiculous.
Oh, it's crazy, right?
Yeah, I'm not too impressed with that.
You and me both. We got somewhere in the neighborhood of 24 inches of snow, 2 feet of snow here, and I had to shovel like 4 times in 2 days. And our driveway now is like, it's like trying to run a gauntlet. It's just like just walls of snow on either side. I shoveled just enough that we can get in and out, and that's basically it. Yeah.
Ours was on Sunday. I went into town, and we probably had about that much on the ground. But it was hard packed. It was hard packed enough that I could actually drive on it without sinking.
Okay.
So I could move up the snow blower or shovel it. My driver's a fair light, so I wasn't going to shovel the whole thing. And by the time I got back, it was getting late anyways. So the next morning when I went out to go to work, it actually had warmed up a little bit, and that all turned to smush.
Oh, yeah.
So it was still too hard that you couldn't blow it with a snow blower, but the car would sink now. And my driveway's on a bit of a downgrade, and it still took me 3 or 4 goes to get out.
Jeez. Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
All right, so let's say hello to everybody who's here. We've got PETA, and we've got Rick and Mark and Atle. And Hey IME is here, and Sandy, Roderick is joining us, Rick is joining us, Mark MC, Matt, Mike Ozinski, Leroy. Hello, everybody. Leroy says, hello, everyone, spring is coming. Sort of coming.
Yeah, not really.
Kind of, sort of coming.
Usually this time of year, our flowers are starting to poke their heads out, but
yeah,
it's impossible with all this snow.
No kidding. PETA says he loves snow and envious 30 degrees centigrade there, which is too hot. Come visit me and you'll see plenty of snow. Although by the time you get here, it might be gone.
That's true.
Yeah. Hello to Mr. Cochise71. What have I been up to? So, like, I haven't, as you guys know, I still haven't been doing any shoots. I did a little bit of rearranging here in the studio. So if you guys had noticed previously in the live streams or my videos, back here in this corner I had some shelves with a bunch of totes that had like all my different supplies and things in there organized in the totes. And I decided to move that into the other room because it just looked a little bit messy and cluttered and junky in the corner of the streams and the videos. So I'll probably end up hanging one of my photos on that wall. Of course, I talk about like having a cleaner, not cluttered, junky look, and then I've got crap all over my desk from what I was doing yesterday, which was A, moving all of that stuff, and B, finishing up shooting a bunch of B-roll for one of my videos. So that's the kind of stuff I've been working on, trying to get this studio like tweaked out exactly the way I want it. And this live stream setup, my camera angle is a little bit different. I've been changing my lights around, so making, you know, incremental steps into making this studio work the way I want it to work, which is really exciting for me. I love that.
Yeah. Oh, you need to switch views so I can see the stream view.
Oh, okay. Let me do that. So, gotta say hello to Dan Warren, and Hey IME says, I love snow too. No snow here in New York, just rain.
I know Dan. He's my uncle.
Oh, well, that's awesome.
That's assuming it's the same
Well,
Dan Warren.
welcome to the show, Dan.
Yeah, we were talking last night, and he's looking at getting a camera. I think he's set on the T5.
Okay, good camera. Good camera. Of course, as we've said, you can hardly buy a bad camera these days.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's pretty tough to do that.
Yeah.
Spring is here in Utah, Mr. Cochise says. All right,
Jealous.
so yeah, we already have, of course, I posted earlier today, and a bunch of you have asked questions, and we have those questions lined up. But as always, questions are welcome. So if you have questions about flash photography, go ahead and drop them into the chat. And of course, anything else is welcome too, photography related or otherwise. So
yeah, exactly.
We've got a bunch of questions, and flash photography is a pretty diverse and sometimes a little bit of a dense topic. So we're going to jump right into the questions. Let me just grab my notes here and get up to the top. And I think one of the best ones to start with is a question that came from Kathy. And I've actually got a little bit of a demonstration set up to try to help illustrate this too, because this gets to understanding the fundamentals of flash photography. So what Kathy was wondering is, she said, what frustrates her, because if you saw the question, my question was, what about flash photography drives you nuts? So what was driving Kathy nuts is trying to keep in mind which settings, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, and how they affect your different light sources, your two different types of light being continuous light and ambient light, or flash, which is an instantaneous light source. So I'm actually going to switch views here. Whoops, I'm going to try to switch views here. Let me get my controls set back up. And I'm actually going to get up and go to the table that you guys are now seeing. And hopefully this demonstration will help you understand how this works and help you cement which settings change how much light you capture from which light sources. So I won't be able to hear Mark. Hopefully you guys will be able to hear me. But I'm going to move over here. And here's the important thing to understand. You have the two different light sources, as I just described, right? You have continuous light, and then you have your flash, which is an instantaneous light source. Okay, so before I even talk about the settings, I just want to use these two glasses of water, which are filled with water. That was redundant. To try to really clearly demonstrate the difference between these two types of light sources, and then we'll talk about how the settings affect how you capture those two different light sources. So let's say you're taking a photograph and you have a 3-second shutter speed. And we're using 3 seconds simply because if I tried to do it for something like a normal quote-unquote shutter speed of, say, 1/60th of a second, I can't count off 1/60th of a second in any meaningful way. So we're going to go with 3 seconds here. And if you're taking a photograph for 3 seconds and you're using ambient or continuous light, that's like the lights in this room, the sun, street lights, any kind of light that is on the entirety of the photograph. When you take the photograph, it's like this: 1/1000, 2/1000, 3/1000. Okay, and the water is your light. If you're using a flash during that same period of time, it works like this: 1/1000, I just made a big old mess. 2/1000, 3/1000. Okay? And that difference of me splashing water all over the place is what's key. Because if you noticed, all of the water from the cup that I just dumped, the flash in this scenario, went into the camera, which is my bowl here, within the first second of that 3-second long exposure. Whereas with the other cup, the continuous light, it was going in for the entirety of the 3 seconds. Okay? This is the fundamental difference between your two light sources. The duration of those light sources during your exposure, during the length of the shutter speed as you're taking your photo. So to get now to how each of your settings changes those, let's see if I can even these out. We'll start with the one that confuses most everybody, which is the shutter speed. Because it is the shutter speed that allows you to separate the exposure of the flash and the ambient light, of the instantaneous light and the continuous light. Because if you change the shutter speed and you go from 3 seconds to 1 second, I can now do this with continuous light. 1/1000, and I have to stop because the photograph is done. Now we've just gotten a little bit of this water from the cup in there instead of almost the entire amount of water over the 3 seconds. But again, with the flash, if we go 1/1000, you still get all of the flash because it happens immediately, unless you make a mess on your table like I just did. So your shutter speed will make your continuous light brighter or darker based upon how you change it, because during the entirety of the photograph, continuous light is going into the camera and being recorded by the sensor. But when you change your shutter speed with your flash, it makes almost no difference. And I say almost no difference because you have to be aware of the sync speed, but we're going to ignore that for now. When you change the shutter speed with your flash, it makes no difference because it happens that fast. It happens so quickly that the shutter speed will not change the quantity of light that you capture from your flash. I should have labeled these glasses. Now, your ISO and your aperture will change the quantity of light you capture from both types of light sources. Because if you have an aperture, this is representing sort of the change in aperture, or ISO actually. I'm going to try to recover some of this water here. This is a mess. If we're acting like the bowls here are a single pixel on the image sensor, then the aperture, or I'm sorry, the ISO is represented by the different size in the two of these different bowls, right? Because when you change your ISO, you change, in theory, you change the sensitivity level of the sensor. As if you've watched my past videos, you know that that's not technically what happens, because the ISO really is a gain or a volume control for you to amplify the signal that comes from the light. But in order to just sort of conceptualize it, we all typically say that the ISO changes how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So what that means is, in 3 seconds, if my ISO is very low, then I'm going to have a large or small? Boy, I had this figured out before we started the show, and now, because I'm talking, my brain just went off the rails. It's small. So a lower ISO is, in theory, a bigger bucket. And I'll explain why in a moment. So at a lower ISO, if I go for 3 seconds again, 1/1000, 2/1000, 3/1000, right? We say we've got all of the water in there. And then I have this smaller one, which represents a higher ISO. And in 3 seconds, 1/1000, 2/1000, 3, we're looking at this, and the idea is this volume of water is more because it's contained in a smaller space. I'm trying to represent this physically. But the basic idea is you've captured more light in that same period of time because you've got greater sensitivity. So continuous light or flash, it doesn't matter what type of light. Your camera sensor, your bucket that you're catching the water in, changes with the ISO setting, and it reacts to all light regardless of the source, whether it's continuous or instantaneous. And then finally, it is your aperture. And I'm kind of out of water, and I didn't have enough time to set up a good way to demonstrate the aperture. But the aperture is the opening in your lens. And this is fairly easy to demonstrate, right? Because if you have a smaller opening whether you are pouring, whether you are doing this over 3 seconds, it can restrict the amount of water you're getting versus doing this in, less than a second. So your aperture, the size of the opening, is going to restrict the amount of light you get into the camera, regardless of whether it's instantaneous or continuous. So I'm going to come back over and sit down, and I'll clean that mess up later, and see if you guys got any questions about that. Oh, Rick, thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciated. Hey, RJ just joined us too. So I hope that demonstration helped you guys understand the relationship a little bit better. Bottom line, though, is just remembering, as however you can, that your shutter speed is what allows you to separate your flash and your ambient light exposures, because your shutter speed will change your ambient exposure over the period of time you change the shutter speed, but it won't change your flash exposure because that happens instantaneously. Okay. Yeah, if you think, so Roderick, that's a good point, but I got a little turned around when I was trying to come up with my demo there, so. All right, so, oh, George joined us too. George says, went in the camera and splashed right back out. Is that supposed to happen? Not exactly, but hopefully that visual demonstration helped. Hey, Brewster's having some water behind me now. You guys see that?
You don't have to clean up afterwards, so.
Right. Oh, yes. Hey, IME just asked if I am going to do a dedicated video about that, but that's a really excellent question, and Mark actually has one of each behind. So do you want to answer and give a quick demo for Edith's question about the difference between soft boxes and umbrellas, Mark?
Yeah, I think that was originally Rick's question. That was one of our ones that was up on the...
Oh, perfect.
In the notes,
so we're going to switch.
Pretty good.
Yeah, so why don't you go ahead and talk about the difference between the two, and if you want to even demonstrate, because you got them behind you, go for it.
Yeah, well, probably difficult to demonstrate, but either way, my headphones don't reach, but let's see what I can do.
Okay.
With it pulling my computer on the ground.
Yeah.
So, basically, this is the umbrella, and right now it's set up as a reflective, not a shoot-through. In this case, basically, the light comes from the flash into the umbrella and comes back. With a shoot-through umbrella, it's obviously the opposite, and this one's a convertible, so I can take the black off. But just imagine this is white, and then the flash would be behind and be shooting through this. The big advantage with doing a shoot-through is that you can actually get right up to your subject. You can get like this close to your subject, and it gives you a nice soft light. Whereas if you're using it as a reflective, you basically have your distance from the flash to here, and then your subject's here. Let me turn that sideways, maybe easier to see it that way. Mm-hmm. But basically then your subject's right here, so you're not as tight, so your light's not going to be quite as soft as it ideally could if you were shooting right up close. But that being said, even still, this distance isn't that bad, and you can still get pretty soft light coming from it.
For what it's worth, it doesn't really matter, but I personally prefer shoot-through umbrellas because they do allow you to get the light closer to the subject. But that's just a personal preference. Like Mark said, it doesn't really matter.
Right, and if you're using a shoot-through, mm-hmm. they're probably better in a tighter space as well, too, just because you can get everything so much closer to work with.
Right.
Now, the biggest disadvantage with a shoot-through umbrella versus a reflective, the shoot-through you have less control of the light. So basically the light shoots into the umbrella, it just goes everywhere. Whereas with the reflective, basically the light goes into the umbrella and comes back, so you're not getting all the light behind it. Nice. So you get a little bit more control, but not a ton of control.
Yeah.
Like, ideally, if you are looking for more control, that's where you want to get into something like a softbox.
Yes.
Softbox. Let me see if I can get this Oh, I'm going to take the headphones off for a second.
Okay. Whether it's a bounce or a shoot through, you're going to get spill with an umbrella because there's nothing to contain the light in any particular direction. It's going to go in the general direction that you're pointing it, but because it's an open light, it's still also going to kind of go all over the place.
Yeah. This particular one, this is actually an octabox. It's not a true softbox, but the principle is basically the same. But you can see it's a fully sealed unit, so no light escapes. You can actually get grids for these as well too, to give you even more control of the light. And typically inside them, like with the umbrella, or sorry, with softbox versus umbrellas, you have this material. I guess I'm not sure. I don't remember what the name of the proper term is.
Diffusion panel.
Yeah, diffusion panel, right. Whereas the umbrella, you typically don't get a diffusion panel.
Right.
So that also helps soften the light as well, too. And a lot of them, including this one, have another diffusion panel on the inside as well, too, to really give you some nice soft light. And really the only difference between like this octabox and a softbox is just the shape of it. A lot of people like a softbox just because it gives like a square catch light, so it looks more like a window light.
Exactly. And yeah, the basic idea behind a softbox is that you're closing in and you're focusing and not focusing, but you're directing all of the light through the diffusion panel and controlling the bounce spill, the slop basically, that you get from that open umbrella.
Right. And again, with this, you can also get right up tight to it as well, too.
Right. So Pete is wondering which way around is the flash in the octabox. In an octabox like that, and generally in a soft box, the light is pointing directly at the diffusion panels up front. So yeah, Mark's going to show you here which way it's pointing, but it comes in the back of the softbox, and it's pointing at the diffusion panel to go out that direction. And can you lower that down, Mark?
Yep, let me lower it down.
Okay.
Take the headphones out again.
All right, so there we go. So the flash goes in that opening in the back there, that little ring there.
Apparently I need a longer cord for my headphones.
Right.
Yeah, it's basically the light that shines into this diffusion panel, and then the second diffusion panel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got a few questions and comments on this, so we're going to go ahead and get through these, and then keep on with the questions that you guys asked earlier as well. So Sandy, we're going to be talking about TTL and manual flash. That's an excellent question. So Hey IME said, if you use a zoom lens, can you eliminate the spill by tightening up the shot? And you can. That's absolutely right. Like if you are shooting a tight, say it's a tight portrait, like a real tight headshot, and there's some spill from the umbrella on the background that makes it a little uneven. If you're zooming in, if you're cropping in with your lens, with your composition tight enough that that's not in the frame, then that spill doesn't matter. And the spill is only a problem if it's something that you don't want in your shot. So
yeah, exactly.
The spill from an umbrella isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of. And what likely trips up a lot of people who do use umbrellas is looking at a shot and possibly seeing light where they don't actually want it, and not realizing that that light might be coming from the spill of the umbrella and the open nature of that. So you can absolutely crop it out that way, yes. Okay, so Steve made a comment. He said you can eliminate some of that spill by feathering the light off as well. That's absolutely right. Mark, you want to explain what feathering is?
Yeah, so basically what feathering does is, I'll just use this, is you can, most people, including myself, I'm guilty of it, is when you're using like a softbox like this, you'll have your subject in the middle, and then the light kind of comes all the way around them. But if you're not looking to get like some light on your background, you can actually place your subject right near the edge, so the only light's coming around the front, and they're not getting any, none of the light is coming from the rear and not going anywhere. So basically, when you're using the edge of your light source, that's typically what they refer to as feathering.
Yeah, and feathering is another way to control that spill. So if you can't crop it in tight enough, with your composition, another way you can move that spill out of frame is by feathering your light, is what Steve's saying.
Right. Now doing that with like a shoot-through umbrella is more difficult, unless you actually have like a board or something to actually block the light.
Right. So let me back up through the chat here. Dan says, is this good for doing, say, product shots for a website? Absolutely. You could use an umbrella or a softbox for doing product shots easily, very easily. Super SS90 drops in, says, sorry I can't stay long. You guys are the best. Thank you for the tips. Thank you very much for that. And Rick says, thank you. Fantastic explanation. I thought it was mainly a cost thing. I mean, there is a huge cost difference between umbrellas and softboxes, and it's kind of frustrating because... To be perfectly honest, I mean, it does take more material to make a softbox, but I get really frustrated.
They made a better material too. Like this is some pretty heavy duty material versus an umbrella is just being made out of cloth.
Right, but like those prices sometimes get way out of line when they're asking like $200, $300, $400 or something for a softbox. That's just out of line. And here's something to consider too. Hey, Tom's made it.
Hey, Tom.
If you can't buy, if you cannot afford a softbox, which I totally understand because all of us, have budgets that we have to live by and have certain amounts of income, you could pretty easily make your own softbox, okay? I'm not going to demonstrate here, but here's all you would need. You would need to go to like your Michael's or your dollar store, wherever you can get foam core board, craft foam. I have a bunch of it somewhere in this house, but I don't know where the hell it is right now. Anyway, you get some black for the sides. For maximum effectiveness, you would also get white, and you would actually glue or sandwich those together with the white on the inside and the black on the outside. The white, that reflectiveness of the white is going to help push light bouncing around the softbox forward out through your diffusion surface. Make yourself a box, put a hole in the back. The hardest thing is going to be figuring out how to attach it to your flash. You'll need to make some sort of a mount. You don't want to attach it directly to your flash because the weight of that pulling down on your flash can damage your flash, right? So you don't want to, even though a bunch of foam core is quite light, it's still a potential damage point for your flash head, right? So you'd want an opening in the back that you could stick your flash head into. You need to figure a way how to hold that thing up, and there are many different ways you could do it. And then on the front, for a diffusion surface, you could use a piece of white sheet. You could use a piece of a white shower curtain, which is what I've used for DIY softboxes in the past. Something opaque that the light will pass through. Boom, you've got yourself a softbox that maybe cost you $10 or $12 or $15, depending upon the materials you use. And if you want to spend a little bit more, you can get something like, let me show you this. I'm grabbing an Amazon link that I'll drop into the chat here. They're not that expensive.
Even for that matter, if you don't have if you only have a flash and a light stand, but you don't have an umbrella, you can still get soft light by bouncing off a wall.
Yeah,
it's a little more. It requires a little bit more playing around because obviously a wall is permanent. So instead of moving the umbrella to get the light onto your subject the way you want it, you have to move your subject instead.
Yeah, and that actually answers George's question, which is, the question was, is reflected light diffused light? He says, I understand that a shoot-through umbrella and a softbox both diffuse the light. So here's what diffused light is. Diffused light is an accurate term, but it's also kind of a confusing term because soft light isn't diffused. Soft light is bigger light, right? So when you shoot your flash through the panel of a softbox or into an umbrella, what happens is that light, as it goes through the surface, spreads out. And when it spreads out, it makes that light bigger. And by virtue of being bigger, that light is able to go in places that it wouldn't have been able to go before. Right? So if I'm pointing this flash at my face and it's coming from the side over here, when it hits this side of my face, because it's coming from this little 2" by 1" or 3" by 1" flash head, it's going to hit this side of my face, and this side of my face is going to be dark because the light can't get over here, right? If I bring it right here, a little bit of this light is actually going to be able to get around the side of my face because this light is now bigger relative to me because I've moved it closer. All right, that achieves the same effect as me having it back here and passing it through a diffusion surface to make it a bigger light source.
Yeah,
so,
and having a big light source is not necessarily the same as diffuse light. A big light source will be nice because it'll wrap around.
Yes.
But having it diffused will give you less harsh shadows and just soften it even more.
Yes. Yes. RJ made a really great point, and hello RJ too, I'm glad you're here, which is that a convertible umbrella can be made to look like a soft box by closing the umbrella around the flash when shooting into the reflective. That's going to close the umbrella down, which Mark's going to demonstrate here. And in closing it down, it's going to contain the light. It's going to reduce the spill because now the umbrella is more around the actual flash itself, which is going to control for that spill that would normally go out the sides. That light isn't going to be quite so soft or diffuse because you've now made the light source smaller by collapsing the umbrella, but it'll still control that spill. So you'll have just like RJ said, you'll have a harder light, but you'll also have a more contained and controlled light.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, so to keep going with the questions, I'm grabbing the ones that you guys were asking here in the chat. So I'm trying to keep up with what we've got. Tom asked, which is better, shoot through or reflective? We did talk about this a little bit, and basically it doesn't matter. It really boils down to personal preference. And like I said earlier, I personally prefer a shoot through because I can get that umbrella closer to my subject if I want that really super ultra soft, big light source look. Whereas with a bounce umbrella, you're limited as to how close you can get it to your subject. But both work just fine. Neither is bad. It just kind of comes into a preference.
Yeah, a reflective will be a little bit harder light than a shoot through.
Yeah, that's another good point. Hello to Hapless Guitar Photography. Thanks for joining us. Alrighty, so I grabbed your questions out of the chat. If I miss a question, Thomas C. Pendleton, hello, says you guys are part of my morning routine. Thank you. Glad to be part of your routine. That's really awesome.
Even though it's the evening for us, but who cares?
Yeah, but who cares? All right, so
technicalities.
Roderick had a follow-up question, which was, if you're using a longer shutter speed for more ambient light, do you have a general rule for when you use rear curtain sync? You want to take that, Mark? You want me to take it?
You can take this one.
Okay. So here's the deal. You don't actually ever really have to do rear curtain sync. It just depends upon what you're going for in the shot. So if you're not aware, first of all, here's how and what rear curtain sync is. When you take a photograph, inside of your camera there is a curtain that is in front of your image sensor.
I want to switch views.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Oops, people can
wrong
see
view.
Wrong view.
All right. So you've got this curtain that is in front of your image sensor in the camera. And when you press your shutter button to take a photo, that curtain opens up to expose the sensor. Now, when you're done taking the picture, it doesn't close back down. There's actually a second curtain that's waiting in the body of the camera that comes up behind to close on top of the image sensor and block it. When you take a photograph with your flash, normally what happens is the first shutter opens and you have the duration of your photograph. So let's say it's for a second long exposure. What happens is the first curtain opens, and as soon as the curtain is all the way open, the flash goes off. and that flash goes off in, say, 1/10,000th of a second. So for the other 9,999 thousandths of that second, the shutter is just sitting there open, collecting light, and then that second curtain closes. Boom, the picture's done. Okay? Now, if you use second curtain sync, what happens is that curtain opens, you wait 9,999 thousandths of a second, and then in that last 1/10,000th of a second, the shutter, the flash goes off right before that second curtain comes up and closes. Okay, so now why does this matter? It matters because when that flash fires will change how any motion blur that might appear in your image will appear in that image. So if you're using a shutter speed that allows for ambient light but does not show motion in your image. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, let's say it's everything over 1/30th of a second, right? If you're shooting at 1/30th of a second or faster, it makes no difference at all if you are using first or second curtain sync, because it's not going to have any meaningful impact on how your image looks, because there's no motion in the image, and that's where second curtain sync matters. If you are using a longer shutter speed that allows for motion blur of your subjects, then you have to decide what you want the look to be. And generally speaking, people prefer second curtain sync when that motion appears in the image because it looks natural. And here's what I'm talking about. I wonder if I can find these images real quick.
Well, I think a good example would be like a car going down the road.
Yeah, and I actually have some images from my flash photography course that demonstrate that. So why don't you explain while I look for those images?
Okay, so basically, if you have a car going down the road and say you have a 10-second exposure, if you have first curtain sync, you'll basically, the flash will go, the car will be captured, and then say the tail lights of the car will end up being in front of the vehicle, because you're freezing the car and then you're capturing the ambient light as the car continues going on through. Whereas if you're using a rear curtain, basically the shutter will open, you'll get the tail lights dragging through the picture, and then just when the shutter is about to close, the flash goes and then captures the car. So it looks more natural because you see the lights of the car behind the car.
Right. So basically the difference in the motion makes it look like the car is going in the correct direction in the image. So I found the images. Now I'm trying to export, and for some reason, why can't I export here? Lightroom, what the hell?
Yeah, Roderick's basically saying, yeah, he's found a lot of people tend to move as soon as they see the flash, so he likes to use rear curtain sync for portraits.
Right.
That being said, if you're shooting at a fast enough shutter speed that no ambient light's being captured, it shouldn't make any difference whether the flash fires first or second.
Yeah. It really, where it matters is if and when there's motion in your image. So I'm having difficulty getting these loaded up here. I'm finding it. Here we go, though. I don't know which image number it is. Of course I don't.
And while you're looking,
8349. Okay.
Comment. You were talking about cheap setups. And
yes.
I'm just going to put a link to Spyros' latest video that basically lays out a flash setup for less than $100. It's a good video to watch. It's recently updated.
Okay, I'm about to get these images set. So motion, and let me grab the other one, and then I can show you guys what these look like. Okay, so while I'm getting those and you're doing that, I want to grab up the next. Let's see what you guys got going in the chat. Sorry, I should have mentioned I do a lot of sunset portraits. RJ says a short flash duration is an awesome tool. I have upgraded studio lights to gain this. Saves having to rebuild hands in Photoshop. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I've found that a lot of people tend to move as soon as they see a flash. That's what you were just saying, so I tend to use rear curtain sinks. Yeah, and that's very smart. When you're doing those sunsets or those longer exposures where you want that ambient light, that's a smart place to use it. So, you know, the answer boils down to the minute you're at a shutter speed that can show motion in your image, it's probably best to use that rear curtain sink.
Right.
Anything?
I'm wondering, Roderick, you're saying you're doing sunset portraits. How long typically are your exposures?
Yeah, I'd actually be curious too.
Because if it's a long enough of an exposure, there's pluses and minuses of using flash either way, front or rear curtain, if the exposure is long enough.
Okay, I'm actually getting this here. All right, so let's grab another question that you can answer while I'm getting these images up here. Which is actually, why don't you go further into the sunset portrait thing, because that's a question that we have. So, couple people were asking about balancing flash and ambient light in terms of the exposure, one of which was specifically about sunset. But Mark, if you want to show what we were talking about before the show, you've got a couple images to demonstrate the difference between your ambient...
Yeah, we'll have one image for the sunset.
Okay, go ahead. You're up, so you can show that. So what Mark's bringing up is some images to demonstrate. Here's a perfect shot. So this is an ambient and flash exposure at sunset. So it's all you, Mark.
Yeah. So basically, in this case, what I did was I set my exposure for the sunset, so I get this nice dark sky. And basically, what I did from there was basically I do that exposure. I didn't take a picture without flash, so I can't really show you that. But basically, I set my ambient for this, and then I adjusted my flash output power to blend her so she looks semi-natural in the scene. As you can see, my settings here were 1/125th of a second, f6.3. So even here, my shutter speed wasn't that long. So in a case like this, rear curtain or front curtain makes absolutely no difference. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when it comes to balancing your ambient and your flash, how you approach this is absolutely critical to doing this successfully. Because if you just go in and you just start taking photos and you just start changing settings, everything's going to end up looking like garbage, and it's going to take you a long time to figure it out, and it's going to frustrate you. So,
right. And your flash has to have enough power too to be able to do this.
This is true. This is absolutely true.
Like this was done with a speed light in just a small beauty dish, so I wasn't losing that much light. But even to get this successfully, I had to have the flash at full power.
Yeah, the more powerful your flash is, the easier it's going to be to do different things in different situations. And there's always a trade-off. Like when we look at speed lights are great because they're small, they're portable, they're very versatile. The trade-off to that generally is that relative to bigger, more powerful lights, these things are not. They're not as powerful, and so doing certain things can become challenging to do because these just don't have enough power for it. But that being said, I've not often run into situations where I couldn't make something work when I was just using speed lights. But to get back to what I was saying, the process that you go through to set your settings and to balance your exposures is critical to doing this quickly, efficiently, and successfully. So how you should do this, how you should always do this, is work one light at a time. Okay, and when I say one light at a time, you always have at least two lights when you're working with flash, because your first light is always your ambient light. And then your second light is your flash. And then if you have more than one flash, then you might have 3 or 4, whatever. But if you're working with flash, there are always 2 different light sources that you have to manage. Now, in the example of that photo that Mark just shared with us, he wanted to include that sunset. Okay? And so before ever getting out the flash, before ever turning it on or even thinking about the flash power or anything else, before any of that, what you want to do is just set your camera settings for the sunset and for how you want the sunset to look in your final image. That means setting...
In my case, she would have been without flash, probably pretty much black grayed out for the most part. Pretty close to it.
Right, but that doesn't matter because we know we have a light that we can bring into control for that and to illuminate her. So whatever your ambient light situation is, your first decision is always managing that ambient light and deciding what you want. In the case of a sunset, you set your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed as appropriate for the sunset to include it in your image. So it might be, in a situation like that, it might have been, well, what were those settings, Mark? Why don't you bring it back up so we can see that? While Mark's bringing that up, I'm just going to switch over and show you guys the difference in the motion on these images. So what I've got here is something that's not working the way I wanted it to. Here we go. So here is this image right here. This is with the truck moving across, this little remote control truck was moving across my table. This was a 1 second long exposure. And if you look at this image, you can see it looks like the truck was going backwards because all of the motion streak is in front of the truck. Even though in the image the truck was moving forward across the shot, across in front of the camera in a normal way. Okay, but because the flash went off on that first curtain, it was frozen towards the back end of the frame, and then during that second long exposure, it was then being captured as part of the image, leaving that motion trail behind, in front of it. Now, the second image that I'm about to show you here is exactly the opposite of that because I used second curtain sync. Here now with this image, all of the motion trails are behind the truck, which looks normal because it now looks like it was driving across the frame. And in this case, all of the motion was captured and then the flash went off right before the end of that 1 second long exposure. So that's the difference visually between first and second curtain sync when you're using flash and you have motion in your image. So Mark, go ahead and bring up that image and we can look at those settings real quick and discuss those. Let me switch back over to you. All right, and I got to see what's going on here in the chat.
Okay, so basically my settings were 1/125th of a second, ISO 100, and f6.3.
Okay.
So basically that exposure gave me my sunset.
Right. And like you were saying before, if you look at all of the trees and all the foliage in that image, in that sunset in the background, that's the exposure that she would have been at with just the ambient light, which is why Mark said before, she would have basically have been blacked out entirely.
Yeah,
because
similar to these trees right beside her.
Right. So once you have your ambient light set, you then bring in your flash. Now, sometimes you're in a situation like maybe you're shooting in a studio like I have here, right? In that situation, you more likely than not don't want your ambient light to show up in the image. And so in that case, I would deliberately set my settings so that the ambient light exposure made everything black, so that when I took a picture without the flash, it was a black image. That means all the light will be coming from my flash. Regardless, the point, the key, and I cannot stress this point enough, is that you need to work one light at a time. And you should always start with managing your ambient and then move on to your next light, which is your first flash, and then move on from there if you're using more than one flash. So let's get into the TTL stuff because people are asking about that. Sandy asked, and Rick also asked here. Rick says, in the case of a sunset portrait, should TTL be relied on? And Sandy's question from earlier was also about the difference between TTL and manual flash and whether, you know, which one you should use. What about TTL? I've been using and experimenting using TTL with various ISO settings. So, Mark, do you want to explain the difference between TTL flash and manual flash and how they work?
Sure. I guess the easiest way to explain it is with TTL, you're relying on the camera to, I guess for lack of a better term, guess at the exposure that you want. And with TTL, it's basically setting it up as per how you have the exposure set in your camera. So it's basically going to blend the light. Whereas with manual flash, it's more about you can adjust the power super strong or real low without the camera having any effect on it. That's basically the quick and dirty explanation.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say with TTL, the big thing is the fact that it's guessing. If you have like a dark background versus a light background, the camera doesn't know this, and therefore when it's trying to take its best guess for the TTL setting, the odds are it'll get it wrong.
Right. To really simplify it, TTL flash is auto flash. It's auto mode for your flash. Manual flash is just like manual mode on the camera, right? In auto mode on the camera makes all of the decisions for you, sets your ISO, aperture, shutter speed, white balance. You have no control. In manual mode on your camera, you have control over everything. You dictate everything. And the same thing goes with the flash. Now, your flash doesn't have a white balance, but your flash has power level settings. And with auto flash, with TTL, that is being set by the camera. You can influence that, but every single photograph you take, the camera is recalculating, making a new exposure decision, and choosing a new power level for that image. Whereas when you shoot with manual flash and you set the power level yourself, it's there, and it never changes until you change it yourself.
Yeah,
so
with TTL, you could basically take almost the same picture, very similar, and get two different exposures because the flash and slash camera is taking a slightly different guess.
Yes, yeah, and that principally is why I don't really like using TTL flash. Now, I don't want to say TTL flash is bad, and I'm definitely not saying that TTL flash is wrong. You can absolutely use TTL if you want to, but you have to understand what you're getting with it and the limitations of it. So we'll go into that.
Limitations is the big thing.
Yeah. So we've got some comments. I want to get back onto those real quick, and then we'll go further into this TTL and manual discussion and separating the two and talking about a couple of scenarios and questions we have related to those. So first of all, RJ says, if you're learning flash, manual all the way. TTL will not tell you anything about the flash power. It's good, but it will get it wrong. And I 100% agree. Just like you can't really learn how to use your camera when you're just shooting in auto because the camera's making all your decisions, right? Just, at some point, every one of you found one of my videos because you wanted to learn something about how to take a better picture, something about how to make your camera do what you wanted it to do. And the same thing goes with the flash. So when you're learning, it is, in my opinion, and RJ's and Mark's, I think it's right to say, that you want to be shooting in manual flash because then you will make the changes and you will see what those changes are in your images when you make them.
Yeah, that being said, I do occasionally use TTL. That's mostly if I've got the flash in the hot shoe and I'm just running and gunning.
Right. And that's a good case for using TTL, and we'll explain why in a moment. So a comment that RJ had regarding the shot that you took, Mark, and this is a good point that is worth bringing up for folks, that he says it's also worth throwing a 1/2 to full CTO on the flash if you can to warm up the skin tones so they balance with the warm sunset. Now, if you don't know all the jargon, you may have no idea what the hell that means. So let's start with a 1/2 to full CTO. I know what that is, but I actually don't remember what the hell CTO stands for. A 1/2 or to full CTO is talking about something like this. This is a flash gel. This is a warming gel. And color temperature orange. Thank you, RJ. And Steve. Yeah. It's one of those words where like you know the meaning, but you actually can't explain the meaning.
Yeah.
So, and what RJ's talking about is the fact that your flash is a perfectly balanced light source, meaning that there's no color cast to the light that comes out of your flash head. And when you're shooting in a sunset situation, just like you saw with Mark's image, you generally have warmer light coming from the sun. And that makes your flash light, the light that comes from your flash, look cooler by comparison. If you want them to match, then you would put... And 1/2 versus full, yeah, it's a brain fart, RJ.
Yeah.
1/2 versus full just determines the intensity of the warming or the orange on the particular gel that you're using. So if I put this gel on my flash, the light that comes out of here now is going to be warm or orange. And if I was shooting at sunset, that would balance with that even better. So that's what RJ's talking about. That's a really, really good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I think when I did that, I didn't have gels, and
right.
I have gels now, but I've honestly never used them.
So Roderick says, won't the CTO mess with the whiteness of the dress? Yes, but if you are white balancing for the warm light, then the light coming from the flash won't mess with the color of the dress because you're white balancing for it.
Right.
So that's key there. If you're white balancing for flash, then the dress will appear orange. But if you white balance for a warm light, then the dress will appear white because you're correcting for that. So Sandy says, does ISO affect the flash setting? And yes, that's what we were talking about earlier. Well, no.
Well, it does.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say, the shutter speed and the aperture, they don't tie together, but the ISO ties together with the aperture and with the shutter speed. So basically, if you're shooting, say, ISO 100, and you have your flash set to say 2.8, and you can't get any more power out of the flash, but you really want to shoot at, say, 4.5. then you'd have to change your ISO from 100 to 200 to bring it up that stop.
Right. So it will affect the flash exposure. It doesn't actually affect the flash setting. And that seems like I'm splitting hairs, but it's important to understand precisely what's happening so that you understand how to control your lights. So like Mark said, when you increase the ISO, and you're using your flash, your image and the exposure from that flash in your image will be brighter because you've increased the ISO, you've increased the image, the sensor sensitivity. But the setting on your flash, the power setting, say it's at 1/4 power, it's still going to be at 1/4 power. You're just changing the resulting exposure in the camera. So let's go a little bit deeper into this TTL question and as it relates to shooting in different scenarios, because we had several questions from people talking about shooting in situations where you need to be quick, you need to get the exposure right, and they want to know about using TTL or manual and getting that situation right. So we're going to start with Tom's question because Tom, I know Tom is here. But if you have a similar question, feel free to drop it in the chat. If you have a very specific scenario that you're trying to get a good result in, give us as many details as possible because that'll help us give you a solution that'll work best for you. And for Tom, he says, I haven't enough experience yet to read a scene for flash, and he's using one speed light off camera. And this is really critical. This is important. So I shoot various events for friends and family in a church or a venue, and I get to the venue early so that I can set up and sets up the exposure and the white balance for my camera, and then put the flash on TTL and take a few test shots of the altar or wherever they might be standing. And when I do that, he's saying, those shots are fine, but then when I add the people to the shots to begin the shoot, I can't predict how much flash exposure compensation I need for each individual shot. My question is there an easy way to shoot in flash manual mode? And if so, how do I set it up when you can't take test shots because you will interrupt the proceedings? How can you predict how much flash to use? You want to take a crack at it first, Mark? You want me to go?
Well, if you're shooting manual versus TTL, it's definitely a little more, wouldn't say complicated. It takes a little bit more guesswork to get the exposure right in a new environment. But that being said, with experience and the more you get to learn how everything works together, it'll be easier. You'll probably be able to get it within 1 or 2 shots versus maybe half a dozen shots. And like what you're saying, you're using TTL originally, and you get the exposure right, but then to get the people in there, the exposure is wrong. So in a case like if it was a wedding dress, that's sort of the camera and the TTL trying to compensate for the white dress and throwing the exposure off.
Yeah.
The TTL is basically an auto mode taking its best guess.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you set the exposure ahead of time and you had everything set in the manual, assuming the ambient light hasn't changed much, then everything should still remain the same for the light output.
Yeah. The problem you're experiencing, Tom, is that TTL variance. See, when you go in there and you set that flash up off camera, that flash stays where it is, and this is important because the flash is always going to illuminate the area you're shooting the exact same way in terms of how the flash is pointing and the area of the scene that it's going to light up. But because it's on TTL, and he just said shots get hot on TTL, because it's on TTL, every single shot is going to be exposed differently because the subjects are going to walk into that scene, you're going to point the camera at them, the camera's going to take a reading, communicate with the flash, and the flash and camera are going to say, I want this much power because of the meter reading off of these people in this scene. Right? But here's the thing. People are, generally speaking, going to expose the exact same way all the time. There may be slight variance, right? But generally speaking, if you have the flash set for a proper, quote-unquote, proper exposure for a person standing in the place that the people are going to be standing, then you could swap people out all day long and never change the flash power and get perfect shots. Right? It's just like setting up a photo booth at like the prom or something, right? Those photographers, when they go in there, they aren't changing the settings themselves, and they are not using TTL every time. So what you want to do is one of the things you're already doing, which is getting there early. Now, the problem you're having is that your initial exposures that you're setting up for are with the altar area or wherever these people might be standing with no people in the shot. And so when you take those photos and you set those settings and you have the TTL flash up there exposing the area, everything looks good because you're just exposing for the altar area. So what you're going to want to do is set the flash up like normal. Before turning that flash on, you're going to set your ambient light exposure. This is exactly what we were talking about just a couple minutes ago, right? So you set it up, that's fine, or just wait to set it up till after. Either way, set what your ambient light exposure is for the scene. If you want to include the ambient light, do so. If you want to black out the ambient light entirely, do that as well. So based upon that, you're going to set your settings. Once you've got that set, put your flash up, turn it on, put it in manual mode, okay? Now, the most difficult thing here is that you're going to need a person to stand in so that you can photograph them and set your flash exposure properly. And if you have nobody else, then you're going to have to bring a tripod along and take a few self-portraits because you're going to need to stand in that spot and check the settings and check the flash exposure at the different power levels until you get it where you want it. Once you have it set, all you need to do is make sure the people are standing in the designated area, and your flash exposure should be perfect because they're going to come in, they're going to stand there, your flash power is going to be exactly what it was when you set it up earlier, and the exposure should be just about perfect. Roderick says, get a guy in a gray suit. So this is a situation where TTL is going to work against you because every time you bring a new set of people in, it's going to give you a different exposure, and based upon you're asking for help here, the TTL is not giving you good results.
Yeah.
So
and in a case like this too, if you don't have someone to take test shots with, this is a good opportunity for a light meter to work well.
Yes, you could use a light meter here. Either method will get you the results, but it might be easier to use a light meter because you don't have to stand in yourself, go back to the camera, start the self-timer, walk over there. You can just, pop off the light meter.
Flash off.
Right. And if you're not familiar with how a light meter works, it's a pretty straightforward process. You basically set it up, and they all work slightly differently, but you basically have to get it ready. Once it's ready to receive the light, you pop off the flash. On the light meter, you set your ISO. Shutter speed doesn't matter, because remember when we talked about it earlier, that doesn't change the ambient, the flash exposure. And then it's going to spit out, when you pop the flash, it's going to spit out an aperture. And if your camera is set to the same aperture as the light meter is telling you, then your subject standing in that spot will be properly exposed with the flash set at that power. So that's a super simple way to do. Tom says, any cheat sheet for getting the power right? I should put one together. But that's the basic process.
Yeah, it's really hard to really make a cheat sheet, because it's going to depend on...
It's going to be a process and not a cheat sheet.
Right, but, like for that sunset picture as an example, I think I probably did 2 or 3 test shots, and I probably started like quarter power, and she wasn't lit well enough, so then I went up and to like maybe half power, still wasn't enough, and then maybe I went up to full power, and it still wasn't enough. And so in that case, in order to compensate for that, maybe my aperture was at like f8, but I wanted more light on her, and I adjust the aperture to like f6.3 to get more light on her.
So if you get a light meter, I think, Tom, based on the situation, I think a light meter would be helpful for this, because if you're getting here early enough, the light meter will let you take the time you need to set it up, and it really won't take very long. So I'm just going to quickly and more clearly walk through that process here, which is A, set your ambient light exposure.
I've got that other picture if we want to see it, the one, the wedding one at the party.
Yeah, go ahead and bring that up, and I'll switch over. And as soon as I walk through this, then you can explain what you did there. A, set your ambient light exposure. Once that's set, B, set up your light and start with the power setting. And initially, you'll just have to start randomly, right? So let's just say you start at a quarter power with the light. Then you're going to take your light meter, turn it on. You're going to set the ISO information on the light meter to match your camera. So if your camera's at ISO 100, you're going to set your ISO on the flash meter, the light meter, to 100. And then you're going to use your trigger to fire the flash once the light meter is ready. And you're going to stand in the spot where the people are going to be standing. And when the flash fires, you'll look at that light meter and it'll say f6.3, right? And if your camera is at f6.3, then you're good to go. And if your camera, if your light meter says, say, f8, that means the light is too bright for your aperture of f6.3 on the camera, right? If you are at f16 on your camera, as an example, then what that would be telling you is that the light is too low power for the aperture that you have set on your camera. So then what you would do is you would increase the power. Let's say your camera's at f16. You would increase the power by 8 to 11, 11 to 16, by 2 stops. You would go from 1/4 power up to full power. And then when you tested it again, the light meter should give you a reading of f16, which would match your camera. That would mean your exposure is perfect. And then you can shoot all day long. Now, yeah, so that's it. I don't want to go too much further, and I'm going to turn this over to you, Mark. You've got these couple images that he wanted to share. These are really great examples of working run and gun with your flash and balancing with ambient.
Right. Well, yeah, and this one here was actually the flash wasn't in my hot shoe. I had it up against the wall behind me. I actually had 2 of them, one on the left and one on the right, basically shooting out onto the dance floor in this area. So that's sort of how I worked it. So in this particular case, I had my ISO at 800 because it was getting dark out, and it was pretty dark in the room to start with. And I had a slower shutter speed, 1/30th of a second. So basically, it ended at f4. So with the fact that I shot it at 93 millimeters, a 1/30th of a second is just, by the rule, isn't that good for getting a sharp image. But using the flash helps to do that. So as you can see, basically the background is pretty nicely balanced to the couple here. They've got some hot spots on them, but that being said, they've been dancing on partying all night, so they're a little bit sweaty, and that's a little bit unavoidable.
Right, there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, like I probably could have turned the power down a little bit more, but then the exposure on everything else would have been dark, and I would have had to fix it. But as you can see, my exposure, I didn't have to adjust it that much, only by half a stop to get it the way I wanted it. But I think this is a good example of showing how the flash has been balanced with the ambient light.
Mm-hmm.
Like I could have had my ISO at 100 and my shutter speed at 1/200th of a second and just blast them with flash, but then you wouldn't get the ambient light in the background. It just wouldn't look natural.
Right. So where's that other one with the shadows that you were showing me earlier? Because I think that's really a good illustration of changing your ambient and your flash to get a better look for what you're trying to do.
Right. So in this case here, this was my first shot, and my settings were 1/100th of a second, f/4.5 ISO 200, and basically you can see behind them the shadows and how dark it is, so you can pretty much tell that the flash was lighting the whole scene, but obviously ugly shadows. So then I adjusted my settings, kept my shutter speed. Oh, so yeah, shutter speed's the same, but I upped my ISO to 800 to just so I was capturing more ambient light. Mm-hmm. But now there's no harsh shadows behind them because I'm balancing the light.
Right.
So basically, this one here looks like it was taken with flash, or is this one here? You can still see the flash on there, but it's a lot less obvious and looks a lot more natural.
Yep, it's balanced better because those shadows aren't there; they're not so obvious, and it makes everything look more pleasing. By bringing up that ambient light, he's eliminating the shadows that are otherwise created by the flash.
Yeah, and when you're running and gunning, this is more the situation where you don't want the flash overpowering things. You want the flash to complement the ambient light.
Yes. So we've got other questions related to this, and that actually leads right into that. But before we do, real quick, I just wanted to share with you guys a photo that RJ just sent here. So this was shot using gels. You're looking at the image now on the screen. And he says this was shot with the Canon 60D at ISO 400 at 1/15th of a second with an aperture of f5.6. The white balance was set to tungsten to make the sky go that really deep blue. And then the flash had a orange piece of cellophane, CTO as he put in there. An orange CTO. And what RJ was doing there, and this is where things get really fun and really creative. What RJ was doing there is...
Hey, Spyros?
Yes.
I'll be back in a second.
Okay. He was manipulating the white balance to bring the blues out in the background, in the ambient light. And then, knowing about white balance, putting a warming gel on the flash, which is going to compensate for the ambient, for I'm tripping over my words tonight, folks. It's going to compensate for the clean light of the flash and go in the opposite direction that he went with the white balance, right? So if your white balance is going blue, and you want your light to look natural or clean, then you would want to add orange to balance that back out. And that's what he did with his flash, so that the subject is exposed in light that doesn't make her look weird or alien, but the background has that deep, rich ultra blue from that manipulation. So that's a really, really excellent way to use flash and manipulate your white balance to get a really brilliant result. Okay, let me get switched back over here. And Ian's question was struggling with run-and-gun photography. So Ian says, I struggle with run-and-gun style flash photography in manual mode. Is TTL the best route? Otherwise, I end up losing the moment and the shot as I play around with the flash exposure settings. Would love to stay... Oh, yeah, he actually can't... He's not here tonight, but he always watches the replay, so I wanted to take the question for him. So... Here's the tricky part, right? This is a case where he's shooting manual, but because he's running and gunning, and because the situation is constantly changing, manual isn't really working, because essentially every single situation he ends up in, every time he moves, every time he goes and finds a new subject to shoot, is a different situation that requires a different flash power. And that means getting there, fiddling, testing until everything's right. Run and gun like that is an excellent use case for TTL flash, because as you walk into these different situations and everything is changing, you're then relying upon the brain power of the computer in your camera to help you adapt very quickly. The trick is understanding how TTL works, and that gets down to understanding how metering works. And what I would recommend doing when you are running and gunning and using TTL flash is making sure that you are shooting with spot metering. And the reason for this is, if you are using TTL flash and you're using the standard metering mode on your camera, which is evaluative or matrix, which if you've never changed your metering mode, that's the mode you are using. And that's not a criticism. That's just, I'm just pointing that out. So if you're wondering which metering mode do I use, if you've never changed it, you use the default standard evaluative or matrix. Those modes look at the entire scene that the camera can see and tries to calculate the exposure based on the entirety of that scene. And that's where your camera can get stupid, because the backlighting, if there's backlighting, might screw up the metering, or something else in that scene might screw up the metering, right? But if you're running and gunning and you want to get as quickly to the correct exposure as possible, if you use spot metering and you've got your flash set to TTL and your camera set to manual mode and you've already got your ambient exposure dialed in, then all you got to do is make sure you put your spot metering point on the subject you're going to shoot, which oftentimes when you're running and gunning is people, so you would probably want to put it on their skin tone somewhere, or if they're wearing a gray suit, put it on their gray suit. And you should get an almost perfect flash exposure based upon that meter reading off of the subject. So Rick just said, so at weddings, is it best to use spot metering? I would say yes. In my opinion, in any run and gun situation where you're relying on TTL flash and you're constantly moving around, in my opinion, you should use spot metering. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I would agree. And probably either aperture priority or shutter priority.
Yeah.
The disadvantage of using aperture priority in a case like that is if your shutter speed gets higher than your sync speed, then your flash will fire. So the TTL can be kind of tricky there. So shooting in a shutter priority might be a better option if you are using TTL.
I would the good thing is more modern cameras generally don't have that problem, because they'll detect the TTL flash and they'll cap the shutter speed at the sync speed.
I guess that's true, yeah.
But in some cases that might not work. So if you're not aware, real quick, just to clarify what sync speed is, if you're not aware, sync speed is the fastest shutter speed that you can use with your flash. And the reason for that has to do how fast the first curtain can open and the second curtain closes behind it. I don't want to go too deep into it, but it is a physical limitation of the camera and flash combination that limits how fast a shutter speed you can use while shooting with flash.
Yeah, and typically it's between 1/160th of a second to 1/250th of a second.
Yep,
those are kind of typical.
Yeah. So Sandy has a question, and she says, do flash modifiers mess with the TTL in a good or a bad way? I would say in a good way, in the sense that when you put a modifier on, like if you're running and gunning with a Gary Fong light sphere, let's say, because here's how flash TTL works. You've got the flash on the camera, right? And I don't have a lens on this thing, but you're looking at your subject and you press the shutter down and you get your metering spot on the person or on the gray suit, and then you press the shutter button, okay? And when you press the shutter button, you don't see it, but what happens is before the shutter starts to open, before the photograph is even being taken, the flash fires. And that light goes into the scene, bounces off of the subject, including the spot you metered, and goes into the camera. And then based upon that light flashing out into the scene, the camera does a calculation and says, based on the spot metering reference point and the light from the flash, I want this much power from the flash for a correct exposure. And then it sets the flash power and the shutter starts to open and the flash fires and you get your photograph. So if you're using, say, a pen container, as RJ called it, the Gary Fong light sphere, the light that pre-flashes into the scene goes through your modifier. So the camera automatically calculates for the modification being made because the light that goes into the scene for the pre-flash for the measurement goes through your modifier. So to me, it messes with it in a good way because the camera and the flash essentially automatically account for that modification and adjust the exposure as necessary. The thing that he claimed gives softer light than an umbrella. Hashtag bullshit. I do want to point one thing out about TTL flash because this will happen to people when they're running and gunning and they'll get frustrated without realizing what's happening. Say you're running and gunning and you're using TTL flash and you point your camera at a subject, you take a reading and you try to take a shot and you look at that and you go, well, that thing's underexposed. What's going on here? How come it's not exposed properly? In cases like that, what's happening is the situation you're in is not allowing for enough light. The flash is not powerful enough to light that scene up well enough. Now, if you're using the flash in such a way that you're pointing it basically directly at the people, that's probably not going to happen unless you're using a zoom lens and you're shooting from really far away. But where it will happen is if you're bouncing and using a modifier on top of that, right? So like if you've got a Gary Fong and you're pointing it up at the ceiling, the Gary Fong cuts out some of your light power by forcing it through all of that thick plastic, and then you're waiting for light to go up to the ceiling, bounce all over the place, and come back down. That can kill a lot of the power, and that could actually lead you to getting underexposed images when using TTL. So
that being said, you can compensate for it by upping your ISO.
Yes, yes. So when that happens, be aware that you're reaching the physical limitation of your flash power. Your next step to compensate is going to be doing exactly what Mark said. Increase your ISO and or open your aperture if possible.
Yeah. Now, one thing with TTL, that is, using TTL isn't meant for overpowering the ambient light. TTL is basically meant for complementing. Complementing the ambient light. So that's why you don't really use it for trying to overpower anything. That's where you use the manual flash for.
Right.
So for running and gunning, TTL is good because you should have your camera set for an exposure that complements the ambient light, and then the TTL will just give you the little bit of more light in it to open things up a little bit.
Right. Now, one other thing to point out, and RJ just brought this up, is flash exposure compensation. So he says flash exposure compensation will help also, but with some camera systems it's tied to the camera compensation. And that is a frustrating thing. What flash exposure compensation is you, when using TTL, you saying to the flash, I want more or less exposure, I want more or less light out of the flash based upon what you're getting from the TTL results. And what sometimes happens is people who are aware of flash exposure compensation will find themselves in a situation where the image is underexposed, and so they go, oh, well, I'm going to bump up my flash exposure compensation, but it's still underexposed because they're not realizing that they're at the limit of the flash's power.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something that's important to understand. So Edith is wondering if anyone uses mag mods on their flash. I know I don't, and I don't think Mark does.
No.
Does anybody here in the chat use mag mods? If so, let us know, and let us know what you think about them. I'm not going to lie.
For the most part, I bounce just off the ceiling. If I'm running and gunning, unless it's a really high ceiling, then I'll try a Waller if I have access to something like that.
Okay. RJ is going to be buying some soon. I'm not going to lie, I kind of want some mag mods. I
think they're overpriced myself.
I think they're overpriced too, right? But this is my current gel system, which is not great organizationally speaking. Like, it works, right? Because I've got Velcro and it's just like, boom, it's super simple and it works. But finding the gels that I want in my little gel pouch is kind of a pain in the butt. And I've got a lot of them because I really like using gels. So I was looking... Yeah, right? So I was looking at MagMod and I was thinking, gosh, that could be nice. And it could really simplify things. But gosh darn it, it's expensive. It's like $30 for the thingy, and I would want 3 of those. So like that's $100 right there. And then I'd want some grids because I use grids a lot. So that would be like $30 to $60 again per flash to get at least 2 grids so I could stack them. And so that's, you know, that's now we're at like $100 per flash. So that's $300. And then I would want 3 sets of the gel kits because I often gel 2 to 3 lights. And I would want both of their gel kits. So I've got the creative. So like I'm looking at like $1,000 to outfit all of my flashes with the MagMod stuff that I would need to be able to do what I can do now with all of my gels and my 50 cents worth of Velcro. So for now, I'm going to continue to suffer with my because I don't have $1,000 for a whole crap load of MagMod stuff.
Yeah. Oh, can I ask a question?
Well, of course you can.
Well, no, not for you, but for the people in the chat.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Just would be curious whether or not people would be interested if we were to do a flash workshop.
Yeah, let us know. Mark and I keep talking about doing a workshop, and we keep talking about getting together either in Canada or, I mean, you were kind of talking about maybe coming to Wisconsin too this year. But
yeah.
Either way, what would you guys be interested in? I know, like most of you probably don't live in or around an area that's close to us. Is that something that you would be interested in? Rick says yes. RJ says do it.
If there's enough interest in a particular area, there's no reason
not to.
Yeah, like if we had enough interest, enough people, then it'd probably be worth us traveling to them.
Okay, so let's see.
Because it's a hell of a lot easier learning something hands-on versus
yes, it is
chit-chatting like this.
Yeah, I mean this helps, but you're right. Hands-on is so much better. So Romana says I use MagMod. They work for me really good. They look like really good stuff, but man, it's just expensive for me to get everything that I would need. So Tom says, could you do it live also? We could absolutely do it live, provided we're in a place that has bandwidth we could use.
Yeah, but again, hands-on is a hell of a lot easier to learn than doing it like this.
Of course, we could do something live like this, which we've done in the past, where we actually set it up and do demonstrations in here. So we'll figure something out. Yeah. All right, so let's get to some more of these questions. I wanted to ask a question as well to all of you. We also want to hear your best flash tips. You're here because you have problems. You want to know our opinions and our solutions for things, but we also want to know your best solutions for flash and shooting out in the wild, whatever that wild happens to be. So let us know your best flash.
RJ's given a bunch of them, so if anyone else has some, definitely throw them in there.
Yeah. Hey, Christopher's here. How's it going?
Hey, Christopher.
All righty. Mark says we should, or RJ says we should come to the UK and he'll host it in his studio. I would love to do that. I would absolutely love to do that. Alrighty, so we have got some other questions. Let me find them. Let's see. Roderick said, if you're using a longer shutter for more, we answered that. We answered that one. Just catching up on these. Peter had a question earlier that I wanted to bring up and just clarify so that everybody is aware. Asking if the lowest native ISO would make the best use of flash from an image quality point of view. And to that, I want everybody to understand that, yes, when you're shooting flash, when you're shooting anything, generally speaking, the lower the ISO, the better the image quality because you're going to have less noise. But that being said, in some cases, when you're shooting in ambient, you may need to increase your ISO to either A, get the ambient where you want, or B, depending upon the situation, increase that ISO for the flash, like Mark was doing.
Yeah, so
in some of those situations.
ISO 800.
Yeah, so don't be afraid to increase that ISO when you need to. Rick Mentor said, I had planned to do a $1,200 workshop that also demoed light modifiers, and somebody else said keep it under $500 for an afternoon. We would do our best to keep it a reasonable cost. Obviously, if I'm traveling, we'd have to account for my travel costs and things like that. But we're not going to try to gouge people. We want to keep it reasonable. We understand that we're all, none of us are making it rain here, right?
We wish.
Yeah. Okay, so Mike had a really good question. Mike Osinski said, how do you pick how far or how close you put the flash in the umbrella? That's a really, really excellent question. You want me to take it, Mark, or you want to go?
Yeah, either one. If you want to take it, then...
Go ahead.
There's not really any right way or wrong way. It mostly depends on the look that you're going for. Mm-hmm. So, with my umbrella here... Myself, I like to keep it far away from the umbrella, and then I have my flash set to a wide zoom, I guess. So therefore, the light's not just concentrated to the center; it'll spread out more and give more light, so less chance of a hot spot. But if you are looking for a more focused light, then there's absolutely no reason you can't have the flash tucked in more.
Right. So
that's basically the short and sweet of it.
Yeah, that's the short and sweet. The farther away the umbrella is, the more of that diffusion surface, regardless of whether it's a bounce or a shoot through, the greater surface area you're going to use to create a larger light source. So the farther away it is, the bigger your light source is going to be, the softer the light's going to be. So if you want it softer, position it farther away. If you want it harder, position it closer. And by the same token, like Mark said, if you've never looked at it, I'm going to switch this to me so it's a little bit bigger so they can see it. Whoops. So, oh, nope, that doesn't work. Never mind. Forgot that camera. On the back of your flash, most modern flashes, you probably can't see it very well, have flash zoom. Up here in the corner it says 105 millimeters. What that changes is the position of the actual bulb, or whatever. Yeah, we'll call it a bulb. It's probably the wrong term, but who cares? The bulb behind the Fresnel here, right? And the closer the bulb is to the Fresnel, the wider the light beam is going to be. And the farther back the bulb is in the Fresnel, the narrower the light beam is going to be. And that's the flash zoom, right? So if you want to fill your umbrella, not only would you take that umbrella and put it further away from the flash, but you would also set your flash zoom to a wider angle to make sure that the light can fill the umbrella. And then by the same token, if you want some diffusion but not as much, you can narrow down the flash zoom to force the light through a smaller area in the umbrella. So these are ways of changing the size of your light to get the desired look that you're after.
Yeah, just something quick on topic, not exactly on topic of what you're talking about. I'm just putting a link in the chat here for my video for the umbrella setup for beginners.
Oh, perfect, perfect. So RJ says, also an ISO 100 shot underexposed due to not having enough flash power and then fixed in post, raising the exposure, in other words, will look worse than a shot at ISO 400 that's correctly exposed. And that's absolutely right. You want to get your exposure as close to perfect as possible in camera for the best look in that.
Yeah.
Let's see. RJ says $1,200 is high. The likes of Zach. I never know how to say his last name. Zacharias charge $800. I would want to know that they know what they are doing and can show me something for that price. Yeah, the more expensive, obviously, the more value you want to get out of it. And I mean, obviously, we're going to want to deliver value, but $1,200 is pretty high for a workshop.
Right, and you'd be getting both of us too.
Yeah. Let's see. Tom says, I'd rather get the white balance right in camera with flash for events. Yeah, less work in post. What do you guys recommend, if anything? Again,
myself, I just have my white balance set to auto, and I'm shooting raw, so it's easy to change it after the fact.
Right, and he doesn't want to. He wants to get it right in camera if he can. So, and that's
if he's using flash, then I'd say set it to flash, but if he has a gel on it because he's trying to color balance to the ambient light, then that's where things get a little bit more tricky, and you have to adjust your white balance accordingly.
Right.
Most camera auto does a pretty good job.
Yeah, I agree with that. For the most part, it does a pretty good job. If you want it to be as balanced as possible, what Mark said is the most important thing. You got to look at the ambient and whether or not you're including that. And then if you are, you'll want to use a corrective gel on your flash to balance the flash to the ambient, if necessary. And then, yes, that's where I was going, Tom. You can just use the in-camera settings if you know they'll work. But if not, get yourself a gray card or a white card or a black card. Doesn't matter what damn color the card is, as long as it's neutral, and use that to do a custom white balance. I use a gray card because that's what I have. Quick side note, I just have to say this because I keep getting comments on the video I did for custom white balance. People keep commenting that gray card is for exposure, white card is for white balance.
Well, see, there's a good video for you.
I know. I'm gonna make a video, but
a video setting the white balance using a gray card, a white piece of paper, and a black piece of paper, and see if you get the same results.
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, you will get the right results as long as your reference point for your custom white balance is a perfectly neutral tone. So white card, black card, or gray card. So yeah, get a gray card, Tom, and then do a custom white balance, and then you'll be good for the shooting as long as the light doesn't change. When you're running and gunning, it's harder because your light can vary from place to place to place. And in those scenarios, your best bet is just to rely on auto and correct along the way. But Tom, your situation is that you're shooting the same spot over and over again, so you can get that dialed in a couple of shots when you're doing your setup, and then not worry about it later on. Alrighty, so Mike says that makes sense. Good, glad we can help with that. We've got more questions. I'm just making sure that, let's see, we're doing... Okay, so we had a question from Amit that kind of goes over some of the stuff that we had talked about before, but we can kind of crystallize this again. So Amit specifically is shooting sunset portraits, and we've already talked about this, and saying, while doing off-camera flash, what is the best ISO to be set at? And I'm meaning set the ISO on the basis of the available light, or set it as per the distance of the flash, power, and zoom setting. And then he says, I mostly face this problem outdoors while shooting single portraits or couple portraits at the blue hour and in night situations. So we don't need to over-tread this ground too much, but that goes back to what we were talking about when we were talking about you first set your ambient light exposure, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. ISO needs to be what it needs to be for that ambient light. And then once that's set, bring in your flash, set your power for the exposure that you want out of that flash to balance with the ambient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might have to have a higher ISO if your flash doesn't have the power to light things. So
yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, if your flash isn't powerful enough, you might have to increase your ISO even more. And this also kind of gets to the same thing, which is something that Carl, I didn't have this in the document, Mark, I'm sorry about that, but Carl Johnston, it's oh my God, my brain's not working. Kristen's fiance, or did they get married now? Kristen Owls, her fiance. Anyway, Carl had a question about getting consistent results in different settings. Settings meaning shooting in this place versus that place versus this place. And that, again, boils down to knowing how to set it up and going through the process to get the result that you're looking for, which means A, going in and setting your ambient exposure to what you want it to be, and then B, setting your flash exposure using these methods that we talked about earlier to get it where you want. That could be using the light meter, that could be standing in if you're shooting other portraits, or just lighting the subject that you want to shoot. And if there's one thing you take away from the show tonight, we're not wrapping up, but I want to say this before we close at least one more time. If there's one thing you take away from tonight's show in working with flash, it's the importance of that process. The process of starting with your ambient and working through your setup one light at a time until you've got everything dialed in perfectly. Because if you don't do that, I can't stress this enough, if you don't do that, if you're just setting stuff all willy-nilly, then things are just going to look like garbage because you're just messing with things and you don't really know what you're changing because you're changing stuff because it doesn't look like you want it to look and you don't know what's going on, and then you just get more frustrated. Then you want to take this thing, you want to throw it through the window and punch somebody in the face, right? So don't do that. Be methodical about how you set your settings up and how you shoot your flash and set your flashes up. And it's always ambient light first, then bring your flash in, and then bring in your next one, and then your next one if you're using multiple lights. Cannot stress that enough. Okay, so let's see what we got going on here in the chat. We got some talk about workshop, which is good. We don't need to talk about those particular things, though. Steve says, it's a process. Step it, and you will get a good shot all at once, and you get confused. Exactly. Hey, Emmanuel just joined. Hello, hello.
Hey, Emmanuel.
Let's see. Hey, IME says, I've used the gray card for exposure, but haven't used it for white balance. That's what I love about a gray card. It serves both purposes. You can use it for nailing your exposure, and you can use it for white balance. And that's why I just have a gray card. I do have one of those little multi-card sets, but when I'm going to do something, I pull out the gray card and just use it because it's bigger, it's easier to shoot, and it's all good. All righty. Let's see. Okay, we talked about the white balance. Gosh, did we get everybody's questions? I think we might have. Does anybody else have questions? We got about 20 minutes left. Ah, Yasu Peter. How's it going? Thank you very much. Peter just joined in, fellow Greek, even though I don't know the language. I know Yasu, but beyond that...
you got one up on me.
my dad is the Greek side of my heritage, and... You know, he grew up in the time where acclamation was the method everybody was taking. So he didn't learn the language, which makes me sad because I didn't learn the language. But anyway, Yasu. All right, if anybody has flash questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we will happily answer them before the end of the show. Otherwise, we can just chat these last few minutes.
Yeah, or if anyone has any non-flash related questions. Is that you beeping?
Yeah, that's the studio camera here just died. I was wondering how long it would last. So it lasts about an hour and 40 minutes, which is good to know.
Okay, we do have a question. How can I light a dance floor at a reception without completely killing the mood? So I'm assuming by killing the mood, you mean killing the ambient light, I would assume.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll answer that. And RJ says, one thing I want to say to us. Go ahead and drop that in the chat, RJ. So, yeah, lighting up a dance floor can be tricky. Let me... oh, no, I don't want to do that because those are private wedding photos. I'm not going to... I didn't check to make sure it was okay with her to share those. So, the one and only wedding I ever shot. But that can be tricky. And again, it comes down to that process. Now, the thing to do in that case, in my opinion, because dancing is fast, right? And with fast-moving subjects, you're going to have a difficult time getting a shutter speed fast enough to freeze that motion if you're trying to incorporate some of the ambient. Now, the good thing about a dance floor is that certain modifiers, I was just reading Edith's question and I used the wrong word. Certain types of ambient light for a dance floor are actually quite bright. The spotlights that might be used, the laser lights, things like that, those can actually be bright enough that they can come into your exposure even if you're shooting a faster shutter speed to make sure that your subjects that are dancing are frozen. I haven't shot dance floors much, but when I have, this has been the method that I've used that's been pretty successful. And that is to find a couple of spots around the dance floor where you can set up a couple of lights on stands. And the look you want is going to be dependent upon, or how you're going to set them up, I'm sorry, is going to be dependent upon the look that you want to get. So what I was going to show you, but decided not again because I don't want to just share somebody's weddings photos without their permission, but is kind of that dance floor look. And the dance floor look is generally going to be harder, kind of bright, harsh, specular, focused light. And if you set like one light up on one end of the dance floor and one light up on the other end of the dance floor, and people are just dancing around, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a really good look out of that, because you've got this cross light coming in. So just about whichever direction people are in, they're going to be illuminated pretty well, but they're also not going to be illuminated in a way that looks like fake, because it's going to look like dance floor light, hard, direct light coming from one direction or another. Provided you don't put an umbrella or a softbox or something on these. Leave these bare flashes just up in those areas. Now, if you want to get even fancier, you could throw a gel on one of those lights if you want to bring in some of like the color of a dance floor. That's, that would be a question of the situation you're shooting in and what you want to deliver. So, you got to make a decision on that. I personally wouldn't do that, but you could if you wanted to. The other thing you could do is, if there's a mirror ball, if there's the disco ball, you could put up another flash and point it at the disco ball and catch that sort of disco ball light in the scene because you're lighting it with your flash. So it's a matter of, again, what we've been talking about is that process. It's harder to do a dance floor, right? Because now what you got to do is think about what you want these shots to look like. And this is where flash really can be a stumbling block for photographers, because it changes how you think about a photo, because you now control the light, which means you put it where it goes and you make the image look the way it's going to look based on where you position it and the power you use and the modifier you use and things like that. That's a very different way to think about flash photography, or to think about taking your photos in general, right? Because in any other situation with the ambient light, you just shoot what you're presented with, and it looks the way it looks, and you can basically see that. You've got to be able to visualize this, and that just takes time and practice of shooting with it. So that's how I'd approach shooting and lighting up a dance floor. And what I would do, they would be, I'm going to say it wrong. I'm just going to say I'm going to say D. D says, would those two lights be manual or TTL? They would 100% be manual, 100%. And what I would do in that situation, what I did when I shot the one wedding I did, was prior to the dance starting, I set those lights up and I took some test photos. And people are out, they're drinking, they're talking, they're doing whatever they're doing, finishing up the dinner and whatever. And I had time, and so I set them up, and I did some test photos. The kids were already running around the dance floor like kids do, which means I had perfect subjects to test on, and I had everything set. So now all I had to do was shoot when the people came out and started dancing, move around, and get the shots that I needed. So, yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, the biggest issue with dance floor pictures is going to mostly depend on what the current lighting, like what the ambient light is like. Like each one's going to be a bit different. I shot one wedding where they had the lights turned down so low that I had to manually focus. The camera couldn't focus on anything. There was just no ambient light at all. So basically all my shots were lit by the flash, but then you get other ones where there's a decent ambient light, and like RJ said, like you can shoot at ISO 1600 and get the ambient light, and the flash is there to help balance everything out. So it's situation by situation.
Yeah, and there were some other comments, so I wanted to read those, but I also wanted to find a picture to show you guys. So RJ said, with a reception or first dance, you have zero light bar or crappy DJ lights that have more color temperatures than I have socks. Yeah, and like for something like a first dance, you generally are going to want clean uncolored light. So you'd want to try to manage that out. Or even if you can, talk to the DJ and ask him to turn those lights off, or her. But in terms of a dance floor, you know, RJ's saying, just like I was saying and Mark's saying, you have to light it up. RJ says 2 lights on the stage if you have a stage near the DJ setup. And in his case, he's recommending flashes zoom to something like 50 millimeters and 1/8 power. That'll obviously vary based on situations, but that's like a good starting point to go with. And Tom had a question of, how does high-speed sync work? Does the flash keep firing short, fast bursts, or just fire once? Mark, if you want to take that, I want to find this image to share.
Okay.
That gets back to what we were just talking about.
Right. So basically, the high-speed sync is, as you said, it is multiple bursts. So because when your shutter is opening and closing with higher speeds, your shutter, your sensor is never fully exposed. So your curtain basically going like that across the sensor, and so basically for each section, flash, 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 and you basically get a bunch of bursts. The disadvantage of the high-speed sync is that you don't get as much power output because it's so many quick bursts. The flash can only recycle so fast.
Right. So it's pulsing, and that pulsing requires more power, which means you get less overall power out of the flash. But it's a great way to manage really bright light and still be able to use your flash as a fill to ease shadows in a particular spot or something like that. So high-speed sync is a really powerful tool. The more powerful the flash you're using, the better results you'll get from a high-speed sync shot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, IME, Edith, I see your question. I will answer that because it's a good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so the photo I wanted to show you guys real quick is this image right here. So this is me lighting up a dance floor, but this isn't a dance floor in the sense that that Dee was talking about, which is, you know, people dancing at a wedding or something like that. But what I wanted to talk about real quick here is, again, that visualizing the scene. And what I've got here is Angela and her husband, Justin, Dax, and we were at this event where they were in this like sort of 70s disco getup, and I was like, I want to shoot a dance floor, I want to light the crap out of it. And I saw a disco ball, and I was like, oh my God, I got to use that. I got to use that. I got to use that. I talked to the DJ, the guy who owned the disco ball, to make sure he was okay with me taking it off and using it, which he was. And if you look at that shot, you'll notice the orange light that rims both of them and lights up the background and sort of sets the scene, sets the stage for the disco. Right? Those are 2 lights, camera right and camera left, pointing at the backside of both of Angela and Justin to both light the scene and carve them out of the background with that rim light. And then if you look at the disco ball, you see that hot spot right there in the blue of that hot spot? I wanted to add a touch of blue in there, and you might not see it super great in the shot, depending upon how small your monitor is. But if you look at the back wall, you can see some of the disco reflection, and you can see a little bit of it on the floor and on them. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about like conceptualizing, right? You've got to be able to look at a scene and decide where you want light to be and where you don't want it to be in order to create the image that you're visualizing in your head. And that's something that just comes from practice. You know, there's no better way than experimenting, working with your lights, learning what they do and how they do it, and then making a mental toolbox so that when you look at a situation, you can say, ooh, I really like this, and I would love this sort of light in this spot on this subject, or something like that. And once you get to a certain point, like you can walk into a scene and your brain just starts firing with the possibilities of what you can do to light up a particular scene and a subject in that scene to make it look just awesome. Okay, so Edith's wondering why I prefer hard light and why I tend not to shoot soft light, and she says don't use modifiers. I do use modifiers, I just don't tend to use soft diffuse light, big light source modifiers. So the modifiers I favor tend to be gels, which are modifiers because they change the light. And I don't know where they are because my studio's a disaster. Here's one. Grids, which allow me to focus and control the light very tightly. And flags, which allow me to block light from going into places I don't want it to go. And the reason I tend to prefer those types of modifiers and harder light in general is what I've discovered over time is that part of what I like is the dramatic transition between the light and the shadow areas in the portraits and the images that I tend to create.
Yeah, you don't do a lot of glamour type stuff.
Not really, no.
Yeah, your stuff is more conceptual.
Yeah, and so for me, that harder edged, that more intense, and more like
dramatic.
Dramatic is a word that comes to me for it, but I don't even know if that's the right word for it. But when I look at my work and I think about using soft light versus using hard light, when I do pull out a soft light, because occasionally I'll do this, right? Like occasionally I'll be working with someone and I'll think, this could work with some soft light. I'm going to give it a try, right? And I'll pull out like my Octabox or one of the umbrellas or whatever, and I'll set it up and I'll be like, okay, let's give this a go. And I pop it and I look at it, and the very first thing I think is, oh my God, that's horrible. I hate that, right? Now here's the funny thing. I like soft light. Like I'll see other photographers who shoot soft light, who shoot really cool portraits using big diffusers and soft light, and I love their work. I just don't like it for my own work. And if I had to like pin down a reason, it would be that I really like the control that the harder lights give me in terms of keeping it where I want it and keeping it out of the places I don't want it. And I do tend to like the really defined shadow and light transitions that really can carve out a subject and sort of chisel them. I really like the way that looks. Oh, RJ says nice composition on that one. Thank you. Peter says, I'm with you. Roderick has a question. Mark, does your trigger have a focusing laser? I switched to the Godox X1, and that has a focusing laser, works great in low light.
My triggers I don't think have a focusing light. I know my camera has a focus assist light built into it. It's not a laser. Mm-hmm. But I typically have it turned off because I just find it intrusive, especially like if you're during a wedding. People see it, then all of a sudden they know their picture's being taken, and
then they change.
Yeah, then they change, or they suddenly smile, and whereas I might have been going for a candid look because something was going on that I like. And to be honest, I don't know whether the laser is visible by the human eye or not.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Rick says, at RJ, dude, you are a pro. Just checked your Insta. Yeah, RJ's definitely a pro. He takes some really, really great work.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, this is a good...
It's nice to have him in the chat here because he can answer a lot of the questions that are going through. Yeah,
in fact, he just sent a photo. Come on. Oh, I'm typing on the wrong... I got too many keyboards here. I want to bring this up. RJ's got a photo showing his dance floor lighting setup. This is a really great way to visualize what we were talking about. So let me just get this image downloaded here so you guys can see that. Let me add it in here. Downloads. Here it is. Open. Let me do a switcheroo here. Okay, so this is from RJ. This was shot with the 5D Mark II at ISO 1600. Crank that up when you need to, right? Aperture of f5 and a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. 2 lights on the DJ set. So if you look at this photo, you can see the light blooms up in the upper left corner and up towards the upper right corner. Those are RJ's flashes, lights, lighting up this scene and giving this really beautiful shot of the dance floor. And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. great visual example of doing this. It's a very simple setup. Like I said earlier, when I did it, my variation was to do it one on each corner of the dance floor because I tend to like a cross-light look, but that's a preference, right? That's not the right way to do it. That's just...
Yeah, there's no right or wrong way.
Exactly. And what RJ's got going on here is a beautiful, beautiful shot. So, Richard, thank you for sharing that. Dee's asking if Richard's still rocking the 5Do 2. He is, if I recall correctly, which is an awesome camera. Doesn't matter if it's getting a little aged. It's still a great camera.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see if there's anything left.
I think even the 5D Mark II, they've only stopped making it not that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, that was a groundbreaking camera, too. Adding a third or a 1DS Mark III as a third body. Nice, Richard's going to do. Let's see. Edith says, thank you for answering. No problem on that. Roderick says, it's a red grid, but it helps you focus pretty fast so people don't notice unless the grid hits their eyes. Oh, that's good to know. Because I think I just got the same trigger, the Godox, and there's a lot of times I'm shooting in low light when I'm shooting with the models on a location at a conceptual shoot location or whatever we might be doing, where I'll often pull out an LED light for focus assist, but if my new trigger has one built in, that'll be awesome. So I'm going to have to check that.
Yeah, RJ is saying they stopped making them in 2012. I didn't realize it was that long ago.
That's quite a long while ago.
Yeah.
All righty. I think we've got everybody's questions.
Yeah, Predator.
Yeah, all right. I'm just seeing... Thank you guys also for the feedback in the chat. We sure appreciate...
absolutely.
We appreciate, A, your participation. Love, love, love that. But also, B, that you enjoy being here and spending time with us. And it is 8 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. So, with that in mind, one last time, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. It means the world to us that you come spend our time. Mark, any last words that you want to add for everybody before we close this baby down?
No, I think I'm good.
All righty.
Well, I guess one word, don't forget to subscribe to us.
Yeah, I was just going to say, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my and Mark's channel. And when you do, if you want to make sure you don't miss any of our videos, hit that bell notification icon. But whether or not you do any of that, you guys know what you need to do, which is get out there and take some damn photos, all right? We will see you next week. Adios, everybody. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Love you all. I got to find the stop button now. Bye.